Thank you so much again for joining us and for your patience. This is our presentation on identifying and addressing trauma, essential strategies for supportive housing staff. My name is Crystal Sosha. I am one of the senior training and consultation specialists here at Rutgers within the School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. So again, thank you for your patience and for being here. I so appreciate that and love to see all the welcomes in the chat. I know there's so many of you here today, so thank you for being here. I will do my best to monitor the chat. I'm having some technical stuff, but we will get through it. All right, so again, welcome. Today's webinar is hosted by DBHR through the Washington State Healthcare Authority. This is an interactive training, and we encourage you to ask questions and participate throughout this session. The slides, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar, will be sent thereafter. So again, we thank you for being here. Again, this webinar really was made possible in partnership with us at Rutgers and the Department of Psych Rehab and Counseling Professions and the Foundational Community Supports team at DBHR. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for being here. Skip right through some of the housekeeping stuff just to keep us moving. As you can tell, your audio and video are muted, but I can see you in the chat, so I will do my best to respond. Emily, if you see something and you want to let me know, feel free to do that as well. We'll save some time for questions at the end, but feel free to engage with me throughout this process as you've already been doing so by pressing those three dots. Next to the chat bar, you'll see a blue button that says everyone. So make sure that you're responding to everyone rather than just myself or just the hosts and panelists. If you'd like to save the chat later, you can do so. Subtitles are now available, so you can turn those on. And as always, contact us with any accessibility concerns. So we're going to jump into talking or covering what we're talking about today. We will be defining trauma, the types of trauma and causes of trauma. So what it is, what it might not be, where it comes from, as well as learning to recognize some of the signs and symptoms of trauma. We'll then, in the second half, really talk about techniques to support individuals in creating a sense of safety and stabilization, which is so important in supportive housing. A lot of the work that we are doing is very much providing safety and also skill building and supporting people in navigating their day-to-day life. And then we'll talk about some additional skills to really implement in a trauma-informed care strategies and interventions that can be quite helpful. So to get us grounded and started, I'm just going to go through an exercise that I find quite helpful and often have utilized within group settings, individual settings, something that can be really kind of creating a safety net for someone. Again, a lot of this work is a bit of trial and error, but again, safety is first and foremost. So what I'd love for us to do as you are getting settled in, just getting yourself into a comfortable grounded position. I'll be reading through a script for us and doing your best to follow along. Getting into a position that feels comfortable for you. Maybe starting off with a deep cleansing breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And maybe taking another deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And I'll walk us through imagining a beautiful pool of water with just the right surroundings. Perhaps you discover it in a quiet forest or nestled in the mountains or in the midst of a meadow. The air around it is fresh, clean, and just the right temperature for you. The season of the year is your favorite. Perhaps it's spring with all living things blooming and growing. Perhaps it's summer, lazy and languid. Perhaps it's autumn, cool and crisp. Or perhaps it's winter, a soft blanket of white on the ground. Noticing the water and how it might look beautiful and inviting. Perhaps it's reflecting back to you the sky or the trees above. Maybe it's flowing and bubbling at the bottom of a waterfall or fed by rivers or streams. It's pleasant to watch. Its freshness smells joyful and clean. So pleasant that you feel almost drawn to its safety and soothing. Noticing the sounds around you, maybe rustling trees or meadow grass, the bubble and babble of water, happy little animal sounds, and birds calling out joyfully. Notice what's right for you. Take your time to notice your pool, its shape, its surroundings, its depth, whether there are little fishes or just clean, fresh water. Perhaps it's shimmering blue or sparkling green or clear as a crystal. The water calls to you to relax, feeling complete contentment and safety. Continuing to breathe and noticing how it's a healing water, the kind that soothes the sorest body and satiates the thirstiest soul. When you're ready, allowing all parts of yourself to explore your pool and take in its healing energy. Perhaps some parts of you would like to sit thoughtfully next to the water. Maybe it feels more comfortable to dangle your feet or your toes in the water. Maybe it feels comfortable to sit or float. As you continue to breathe, noticing the water in the pool is the most special that you've ever encountered. It supports you as you sit or wherever you are, as though you were leaning back into loving arms. It calms you and restores you, fills you with a peace and a lightness, letting your tension and fear and shame and worries be drawn from you to the water and carried away. Letting this water surround you, noticing how refreshing it might be. It's your special place of healing and hope and soothing. And as you continue to breathe, maybe just noticing what this moment is like for you. This is your pool where all parts of you can come as they please. And when you're ready, taking another deep cleansing breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And when you're ready, you close your eyes, maybe opening your eyes back up, getting readjusted to the room and the space around you. And when you're ready, bringing yourself back to our presentation. Feel free to let me know what that was like for you. If this is something you've done before, was it easy? Was it difficult? Was it challenging? What did you notice? It was great, relaxing. And I don't blame you. I know it's hard in a busy office to really focus on visualization. Oh, I write preambles for meditations, and this was very fluid, very peaceful, relaxing, new calm space for me. It's what I needed. Oh, love that. It was lovely. I'm glad that you enjoyed it as we're reorienting into our space, middle of the day. Thank you. Someone told me I should record meditations at one point. It's funny because it's one of those things where you don't like the sound of your own voice, but other people find it calming. So, hey, whatever works. Good way to reorient. Felt wonderful. Actually closed my eyes. Amazing. Okay. All right. So I'm going to keep us moving. Thank you, Emily. Moving into our next part, just want to get us situated here. We are here to talk about trauma and what that is and what it means. And we'll play this video in just a moment. But tell me what comes to mind, and you'll see a quote here. I don't want to give too much away. I'd love to hear from you all. What comes to mind when you think about what trauma is? What is trauma? When an incident happens and causes you to startle or hold your breath. I like those visuals. The experience someone has that causes pain, suffering that has yet to be processed. Oh, lots of great responses. I know there's a lot of folks here. So trauma is an event or circumstance or experience that is held within the heart, head, and nervous system. Oh, past or current issues that have created barriers to heal and move forward. Physical, emotional, psychological response to something traumatizing, an interruption in the parasympathetic system that causes breaks in neurosynapses. The aftermath can be stored at a cellular level. Body's reaction to an experience. Experiencing negative emotions to the point that you don't know how to cope with them. Extreme adverse event that you experience or witness. The Body Keeps Score, yes. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a book, if you haven't yet read The Body Keeps Score, really great book that talks about a lot of this work. A feeling that gives hurt, hardship, pain. Trauma is very individualized. Each person will respond to an event or series of events that will impact the way that you think or behave. For example, the starting activity was calming for everyone else, but actually was very triggering. Yes. And I apologize with the technical difficulties. I meant to give a disclaimer around doing what you need to feel comfortable and safe today. There may be things that are really difficult to talk about. There may be things that are really uncomfortable. So just being mindful of doing what you need during this time. Great. So I'm kind of seeing similar responses throughout the chat. And you'll see this quote here from Bessel van der Kolk that trauma is not the event that happened, but how you respond to it. Trauma is really this emotional response to a distressing event. And so we'll take a look at this video briefly from Bessel van der Kolk, who is a psychiatrist really noted for his research in post-traumatic stress. And a lot of his work focuses on the interaction of attachment, neurobiology, developmental aspects of trauma's effects on people. So we'll take a look at this video.
Uno momento. 1 minute.
We're having lots of technical difficulties today. Sorry about that. Is anyone familiar with Bessel van der Kolk and his work, or the Body Keeps Score? Yes. Yes. Lots of yeses. Okay. No pressure if not. Really great resource. Great book, yes. Usually highly recommended, especially when we talk about trauma. One of my permanent desk books. Yeah, I think I have a few too many permanent desk books, but here we are. Very emotionally challenging, but wonderful. Yeah.
Crystal, do you have a link for the video? Because it's not playing from the PowerPoint.
So fun. Let me see. I might try to play online. Okay, wait. If I could just zoom in here.
The most important thing to know is that there's a difference between trauma and stress. As I like to say to people, life sucks a good amount of the time. We all have jobs and situations that are really unpleasant. But the moment that situation is over, it's over. The problem with trauma is that when it's over, your body continues to relive it. My name is Bessel van der Kolk. I'm a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and author of the book The Body Keeps Score. I got interested in trauma on my first day working at the Veterans Administration. 1978 was the year, and the Vietnam War was over by about 6 or 7 years. The very first day that I met Vietnam veterans, I was just blown away. These were guys who were my age, who were clearly smart and competent and athletic, and they clearly were just a shadow of their former self. Their bodies were clearly affected by trauma, and they had a very hard time connecting with new people after the war. Around that time, a group of us started to define what trauma is. And in the definition of PTSD, we write, these people have been exposed to an extraordinary event that is outside of normal human experience. In retrospect, that shows us how ignorant and narrow-minded we were, because it turned out that this is not an unusual experience at all. People usually think about the military when they talk about trauma, but at least 1 out of 8 kids in America witness physical violence between their parents. A larger number of kids get beaten very hard by their own caregivers. A very large number of people in general, but women in particular, have sexual experiences that were clearly unwanted and that left them confused and enraged. So, unlike what we first thought, trauma is actually extremely common. There's a lot of debate of what a trauma is to this day. But basically, trauma is something that happens to you that makes you so upset that it overwhelms you. There is nothing you can do to stave off the inevitable. You basically collapse in a state of confusion, maybe rage, because you are unable to function in the face of this particular threat. But the trauma is not the event that happens, the trauma is how you respond to it. One of the largest mitigating factors against getting traumatized is who is there for you at that particular time. When, as a kid, you get bitten by a dog, it's really very scary and very nasty. But if your parents pick you up and say, "Oh, I see that you're really in bad shape, let me help you," that dog bite doesn't become a big issue because the foundation of your safety has not been destroyed. We are profoundly interdependent people, and as long as our relationships are intact, by and large, we're pretty good with trauma. It's a subjective experience, and what may be traumatic for you may not be traumatic for me, depending on our personality and our prior experiences. The problem with trauma is that it starts off with something that happens to us, but that's not where it stops, because it changes your brain. Much of the imprint of trauma is in that very primitive survival part of your brain that I like to call the cockroach brain. There's a part of you that just picks up what's dangerous and what's safe. And when you're traumatized, that little part of your brain, which is usually very quiet, continues to just send messages. I'm in danger.
I'll pause here because we'll get into some of this in just a moment. But really taking the takeaway from this, essentially, or what I want you to take away, is that trauma is an injury. Think about like a physical injury, it's an emotional injury. So it's a wound that can be healed, and it's more about the reaction than the event itself. Anything that you took away from this video before we keep moving? Okay. So we'll jump to our next slide then, talking about trauma in more detail. And so when we're thinking about trauma, we're thinking about 30 years ago, at some point, there was a lot of belief around the fact that people thought that you had to disclose all of your traumatic experiences in order to really facilitate healing. And what they found was that oftentimes that really intensifies the effects of trauma, which makes it feel overwhelming. People might experience greater feelings of shame, grief, anger, could flood new memories, make the trauma even more unbearable. So a lot of people then ended up engaging in maybe more self-destructive behaviors instead of really in this healing process, where individuals then experienced reopening of old wounds and exacerbating some of this pain. Emily, if you could click a button for me. So you'll see here, and what we're talking about is that oftentimes a traumatic event doesn't ever feel over, because traumatic events leave behind what Janina Fisher, who is an expert in trauma, calls a living legacy of symptoms. So surviving trauma is really complex, knowing how our brain and body and minds respond to these overwhelming events. And so these living legacy of symptoms are really the memories that are left behind, or the reactivating trauma-related feelings that happen in someone's body. And so sometimes if you're working with someone, And maybe you're noticing they're experiencing anger or distress or frustration, or they're experiencing trauma symptoms that we'll talk about. Maybe this person is really experiencing these memories again. And sometimes we might, jump into the place of like, this person's being difficult, they're being frustrating, they're being, quote, challenging. And really this person is doing their best to navigate and survive some of these symptoms that they're experiencing. So the body really and the brain respond to the environment as if danger were still there. So there's oftentimes this connection to a person believing that their alarm system is going off, like internally, or kind of the feeling of this lion or tiger in the room. Body is remembering what had happened in the past. And so the symptoms really represent a way that a person's body and mind has now adapted to those traumatic events. This person is now learning to survive. They are now experiencing some really difficult emotions, feelings, reactions, responses. And oftentimes sharing full details of a story doesn't necessarily change those responses. So what we'll talk about in the latter half of this is some additional skills that might help to support people in terms of grounding, recentering, getting back into their body, which could be quite comfortable. So we'll talk about those symptoms in just a bit. We'll move to the next slide to talk about types of trauma. When we think about different types of trauma, you can show the full list. Thank you. Emily's assisting with my tech support today, so bear with me here. There's many different types of trauma. When we think about trauma, maybe there's something that's missing that you're noticing already, but we'll talk about a few of these. So when we think about acute trauma, could even be one event. Maybe the experience was so overwhelming so that it left a person's nervous system really stuck in this threat response or this sense of the fire alarm is going off. With chronic trauma, could be when a person experiences repeated, prolonged traumatic events. Sometimes this also connects to complex trauma. You've heard of complex PTSD or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Often results from this exposure to varied and multiple events, often interpersonal in nature. So think about people who, if you're working with someone who may have grown up in an invalidating home environment, a lot of emotional abuse in the home growing up, along with many other kinds of abuse as well. Racial trauma could impact or looks like the effects of racism on an individual's mental and physical health. Historical trauma, thinking about this multi-generational impact of trauma, which could be experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. There's also collective trauma. There's so many different when we think about trauma, but again, reminding ourselves that what we're really looking at is how this person is now responding and how is it impacting their day-to-day functioning. Sometimes it could not be noticeable to this person. Sometimes it's noticeable to us, but we want to be mindful of what a person is experiencing. Next slide, please. When we think about trauma, what are some of the causes of trauma? Thinking about maybe people that you're working with in supportive housing. What are some of the causes of trauma? Abuse, neglect, abuse from family and friends, instability, lack of support, homelessness, divorce, food insecurity, domestic violence, homelessness, loss of loved ones, abuse. Western State Hospital. And since we're on East Coast, I'm not familiar with the hospital, but imagining inpatient hospitalizations contributing to some level of trauma. War, displacement, social distance. Yeah, think about what we all just went through with the COVID-19 pandemic. Sudden or medical emergency disease, absolutely. If you could share next slide. So there's a bunch that we'll see here. Many of us have already identified some of these, and oftentimes, again, it's not the objective facts of an event that determines whether the event is traumatic. It's really the way in which a person internalizes those emotional experiences of that event. I think there's some more. So seeing here all of the following, and many of us have mentioned these. And these could be things that the people that you're working with are experiencing as well. It could look different for each person, and being mindful, someone going through a trauma, let's say two people experience the trauma at the same time, they might have different emotional responses or reactions. So keeping that in mind. Moving to our next slide. And I realize we don't have a poll actually per se, but we can use the chat to poll here. Do you work with someone who has experienced trauma or has a diagnosis of PTSD? And if so, how do you know? What tells you that? Oh, legal trauma, general systems of trauma, yeah. Yes, self-disclose maybe what they've chosen to share with me. And yeah, all of the people that you're serving have experienced homelessness. Sometimes they tell me, sometimes self-disclosed. And I love that. I assume everyone has experienced trauma in some form. And I think that really speaks to a trauma-informed approach. We really need to be getting or going into a meeting with someone or appointment with someone or an interaction with someone and taking that stance that we believe that they may have likely experienced some form of trauma. How they respond to questions, situations, self-disclosure. Yes, love that. Also, I do my best not to assume or armchair diagnose anyone I work with while also being trauma-informed. Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like we have a sense of the people that we're serving, and you're so right that it is more common than we realize. And sometimes, again, if we're noticing, I'm seeing these kind of examples of really challenging circumstances, like really taking the stance of, yeah, this person has been through something really challenging, really difficult, really impactful, whether they are sharing maybe some of those memories or symptoms with you, they likely have experienced something, and doing our best to navigate that, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Next slide, please. So when we talk about prevalence, and this is more just informational, most people who go through a traumatic event actually will not develop post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a diagnosis within the DSM-5 TR now. So the diagnostical manual is the diagnostical statistical manual. Oh, that's embarrassing. The DSM-5 TR, which is really used to diagnose. Most people, again, who go through a traumatic event will not develop PTSD. And we can attribute this to maybe criteria could be updated. Maybe criteria is not accounting for a lot of the experiences that the individuals that we serve encounter. But almost 6 out of every 100 people will have PTSD at some point in their life. Text revised. TR is the text revised. So the DSM-5 has been revised in the last few years. Yes. And about every 6 out of 10 men and 5 out of every 10 women will experience at least one trauma in their lives. So those who identify as men or women. So this number counts people who have PTSD at any point in their life, even if their symptoms go away. Some people might recover in a few months or find navigating their symptoms easier. Others' symptoms may take or feel like they're lasting for years, or begin long after the event. So keeping all of this in mind as we are moving forward. Next slide. And again, as we mentioned, trauma survivors or people who have experienced trauma have symptoms instead of memories. So we'll talk about on the next slide what these living legacy of symptoms are. Next slide. So there's several here, Emily, I think there's about 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, almost 20 different symptoms that we're looking at here. And I totally agree, yes. Numbers are varying over time, and I'm sure it doesn't include maybe things that weren't reported. So keep that in mind. When we talk about this living legacy of symptoms, these are some of the things that might come up, and oftentimes they overlap with so many other diagnoses, which makes it all the more challenging to really understand what's happening for someone. These symptoms might be triggered or re-triggered. This person might be experiencing them after the event, long after the event. How many of your clients experience some of these symptoms? If not all of them. Yeah, I'm seeing all of them. Definitely. All, yeah. All, okay. So I have a feeling we're pretty familiar with symptoms. On the next slide, we're going to talk about why do we have these living legacy of symptoms instead of memory. So bear with me as I go through this. This is again from Janina Fisher's flip book, which is really great. Emily, you can click through if you'd like. So to understand trauma responses, some people find it helpful to understand what's happening in their brain. I was recently working with someone and they wanted, simply psychoeducation. I'm like, why is this happening to me? I just want to make sense of it. And this will be provided after, yes. Thank you for the clarification on the DSM. I had a brain fart. So when we're thinking about this living legacy, what we're really looking at is these 3 parts of the brain: the thinking brain, the mammalian brain, and the reptilian brain. So the thinking brain includes our frontal lobes, which is really the part of our brain that uses language, logic, reason, problem solving. It's our rational part of our brain, but it doesn't really account for our emotional responses or emotional impulses. With the thinking brain, what we're really looking at is this part of our brain that is responsible for allowing us to put words to what we experience. So again, it helps with reason. You'll see problem solving, verbal expression. And so it's not emotional at all. It's very logical, fact-focused, reason-driven. The mammalian brain, which is this next part right in the middle of the slide here, or our emotional brain, also lacks language. So which is why we have feelings that we can't put into words sometimes, especially when emotions are so intense. It can be hard to think or speak clearly or to make sense and really have an effective conversation. So all of this is our feelings, very much nonverbal, kind of those gut memories. And this is where we store those emotional memories, but without maybe words or pictures. And then our reptilian brain is the part of us that acts instinctively. It's the part of our brain that has existed the longest, hence the name, but it is that brainstem, which is responsible for our heart rate, breathing, kind of those instinctive reactions, has no words or emotions. So these pieces of our brain all work together and really support us in understanding why we have this living legacy instead of a memory. And we'll talk a little more on this next slide. So we remember trauma with our feelings and our bodies. If you're someone who has read The Body Keeps Score, you know a lot about this. But what we're really looking at, again, when people with a trauma history wonder, did I make this up? Is this really happening? Am I lying? Am I going crazy? Oftentimes, some of the memories are missing or fragmented or incoherent. So when someone's exposed to a threat, their thinking brain is really the part of them that shuts down. The amygdala is part of their brain that this fire alarm is going off, which then helps to defend us. So as our thinking brain shuts down due to this fire alarm going off, a person is not able to think clearly. They're not able to remember an event. Their body is sounding this alarm as if they're in danger, even though they might not be in danger, but it is a way for our bodies to protect ourselves. And so we'll talk a little bit also about, I'll give a better visual about how this looks in our brain. But remembering that these parts, so if our thinking brain is there and it's responsible for logic and reason, but our alarm system goes off, so now we can't think clearly, and now we can't make sense of what's happening to us, and now we're just reacting instinctively with our bodies. Maybe our heart rate speeds up, maybe we stop breathing, maybe we're hyperventilating, maybe we become tense in our body. So we'll look at the next slide, when a trigger happens, how that continues to show up in this thinking mammalian and reptilian brain. So when a trigger happens, our thinking brain, again, shuts down as if we're in danger. The brain says it's better to assume that we're in danger than to trust safely. So a trigger is really activating now this emotional and body memory, not the event memory, just triggering what happened at the time of a traumatic event. Maybe this person is in a room and someone closes the door really loud, and this person hyper startles and kind of jumps out of their seat. Body's telling them that they're in danger because of this really loud noise that might remind them of a traumatic event. And so then the rest of their body is now trying to figure out how to respond. And they're using those survival responses that worked before because they're automatic. But oftentimes triggers are sudden and we don't know when they're going to happen. So a lot of the work that we're doing is supporting people in identifying some of those triggers and helping them to navigate triggers, which are really feelings about the past. And it's these triggered feelings that tell us about what happened long ago, but oftentimes these quote regular feelings that tell us about the present. So really helping this person discern, am I experiencing this because of something that happened to me? And how can I support and ground myself back to the present? So to resolve some of the traumatic memories, next slide, please. What we're really supporting someone in doing and navigating these three parts of their brain is, again, noticing and helping this person observe that there is a trigger happening. This could look like stating or helping this person identify, this is triggering, I'm triggered, I could be feeling triggered. This is a feeling flashback, not something bad happening. And then we're connecting these other pieces of our brain. So that's our thinking brain, the thoughts, the things that we're saying out loud. The mammalian brain, again, is our emotions. So telling ourselves and maybe nurturing our body that we are safe rather than in danger. And then that reptilian brain is reminding us this is just a memory rather than I'm in danger. And so the more that we tell ourselves that we're safe, the more that we can slow down these triggers and recover. Our body needs to calm down so that if we often respond to feelings as if we're in danger, we'll become more activated. So helping to ground and using statements to get back into a place that's centered. Next slide. So this is such a fun thing. Is anyone familiar? Well, I think it's fun. Is anyone familiar with Dan Siegel and the hand model of the brain? Oh, yes, we've got some experts in the room. Amazing. Okay. And this is so great. I mean, with anyone that you're working with, really using your hands to imagine your brain. So what we're going to look at, and I'll point my hand up as well in just a moment, but you'll see this image describing the brain. And so what we're seeing essentially here is using our hand to visualize what our brain looks like. So you'll see here, I like to use that right side, the green, yellow, and red kind of images. Taking a look at your hand, when we see our hand, the wrist is really the spinal cord of our brain. The bottom of our hand is this brain stem or downstairs. Yes, flipping my lid. Downstairs brain, this part that keeps you alive, the part that is responsible for your breathing, heart rate. Your thumb is responsible for your emotions, that amygdala, that alarm that kind of goes off. The part of us that senses danger. Your fingers up here are your thinking brain. So the part of us that we talked about that helps you talk to other people, problem solve, using logic and reason really controls your thinking and helps you be able to really tune into someone. And so oftentimes when we think about this, Dan Siegel calls this flipping your lid. So it's when the thinking brain goes offline. So when your thinking brain, which are these fingers up here, and your feeling brain, which is kind of this palm of your hand, when the amygdala, which is your thumb, sets off this alarm, you're flipping your lid, which is Dan Siegel's words, and really describing when the thinking brain goes offline. So your thinking brain, these fingers above, are no longer connected to your emotional brain. So this is when someone becomes really emotionally dysregulated, screams, cries. It happens when we get stressed, angry. And so to bring it back online, what we're doing is to connect these pieces back together. When we're flipping our lid, our brain is unable to think clearly, unable to speak effectively. It really is a moment to notice what's happening. Dan Siegel says, name it to tame it. So similarly to the slide previously, we're talking about helping this person identify, I'm feeling triggered in this moment when thinking brain and feeling brain are no longer connected. This closed fist really shows, imagine like this is the brain inside your head. A closed fist really shows an emotionally regulated person. So our thoughts and our feelings are all connected. You'll see this kind of yellow zone. Maybe this is when a person is starting to feel some triggers, noticing changes in their body. And then when they're fully flipping their lid, their fingers are all the way up. So this can be a really great way to help this person notice what's happening in their brain. Some people find it validating in some way. And knowing how the important part is really to reconnect these two pieces back together. So encourage, if you haven't seen Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain, he explains this in more detail on YouTube or probably anywhere online. So hope that's helpful to notice some of these pieces that we were just talking about in more of a visual way. Next slide, please. So when we talk about now the nervous system, actually I should ask, are there any questions on that hand model of the brain? Does that make sense so far? There's a lot of content being thrown at once, so just want to check in. Okay. So when we're looking at our nervous system, we've got a couple parts. The part of ourself, or the sympathetic nervous system, that responds by fight or flight. So it's the part of us that says, don't just sit there, do something. So our body is ready and preparing for action. And then the other part of us is this parasympathetic nervous system, or the part of our body that goes into freeze or submit, responses that tell us don't move, it's not safe. Slow down, freeze, be gentle, be small, play dead. And so oftentimes you'll see submit, you'll see fawn as well. So some people call it the 4Fs, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Fawn, submit often have been used interchangeably. or as another layer, but thinking of a person that you might be working with who engages in kind of people-pleasing behaviors, lacking identity, lacking boundaries, feeling overwhelmed. Yes, yes. And so in order to help a person really navigate this fight, flight, freeze, submit, we want to help them become aware of their window of tolerance. Next slide, please. And so when someone is outside of their window of tolerance, you'll notice that they might be in either hyperarousal, which is when someone is irritable, overwhelmed. This could be, again, someone in that fight or flight mode. This could be someone who is feeling unsafe, is feeling threatened. And then the bottom there, you'll see someone who's in hypoarousal, or that freeze, shut down. They're feeling overwhelmed, numb, passive, dissociative, disconnected, not really present with you in the room. And so in the middle of that is helping a person navigate this optimal arousal. If you could click the button for me. Their window of tolerance in the middle of that really is a place where someone can think and feel at the same time. They're connected to both logic and reason. They're able to adapt to situations. People are able to process, think clearly, integrate information. So imagine this as a box, and I think I have it on the next slide. Yeah, if we could go to the next slide. Two examples here. So when someone has a really narrow window, what you'll see on the left slide, this person might really be struggling with having access to skills or has a really limited capacity to handle stress. So they're constantly, you'll see this kind of red line going up and down like a roller coaster, constantly struggling with being able to navigate the feelings of overwhelm plus the shutdown experiences. But someone who is able to regulate their emotions more effectively, you'll see on the right side, maybe is someone who is resourceful or resilient under stress, has a larger window of tolerance. So they're able to bounce up and down from feeling overwhelmed, but they're able to navigate that and they're not going outside of their window of tolerance, meaning they're never in a place, or they're able to successfully navigate those places where they're feeling irritable or they're feeling impulsive or they're feeling angry or they're feeling depressed. And they have the skills to be able to use that. So that's really what we're doing, teaching someone to grow their window of tolerance, meaning grow their skill set, grow their toolbox to be able to successfully navigate some of these really difficult feelings. Next slide, please. You'll see another example here, and we'll share all of this with you. But this window of tolerance, really putting this all together, you'll notice, is it blurry or is it just me? You'll notice at the top in that red zone is someone who is experiencing hyperarousal or that fight or flight. In the bottom, they're experiencing hypoarousal. Oh, so we're clearing up maybe a bit. So feeling too little, not feeling much at all. And then the green zone is their optimal arousal zone. So they're able to successfully use skills to navigate their intense feelings. And you'll see kind of on the side, a person who's in that fight or flight needs soothing and grounding skills. And really the same in someone who's in hypoarousal or feeling too little or feeling depressed, needs some gentle stimulation, maybe compassion, a lot of orienting to time and place, especially if someone's experiencing dissociation. Next slide, please. So when we think about strategies for hyperarousal, all the fun things that exist here are so helpful. Let me know which sounds familiar to you or which you turn to often. So to support people when they're in this state of hyperarousal, or when someone, again, is panicked, super anxious, irritable, overwhelmed, angry, we need techniques to settle your mind and to calm and soothe. So this might look like using distraction skills. So helping someone to almost slow down and reset. Oftentimes people use distraction and they say try not to use it forever because you can't run from your feelings forever. But maybe this person is doing something to watch TV, or they are engaging in reading a book, or they are stepping outside and connecting with nature. Containment, which could be kind of in your mind or it could be verbally expressed out loud. This could be simply noticing and helping this person become more aware of like, this is something that I can't tolerate or I can't navigate right now. I'm gonna put this away or put it in a box and I'll return to it later. Breathing, mindfulness, imagery, kind of like we did that visualization, helping this person find this safe place through imagery or visualization. Grounding through those five senses, and I gave some examples here. Some people really enjoy loud music and doing what is best for this person. This could also look like having access to ice, so helping this person's body re-regulate when someone is feeling overwhelmed. Oftentimes body feels hot. So connecting to ice, this could be helpful to use like around temples or the back of your neck. Peppermint is a quick one if someone is able to, and this is like being mindful of someone's relationship with food or foods or things that could be triggering, of course. Accessing peppermint, lemon, red hot, gum, Sour Patch Kids, warheads, all those things that really help bring someone back into their window of tolerance. Noticing their environment and what that looks like. It could be a warm bath shower. And yes, absolutely. Emotional freedom technique, which is tapping, humming, singing, dancing, calming music and sounds, finding a really comfortable place to lay with a cozier weighted blanket. All of these things can be quite helpful in helping this person to really navigate hyperarousal or that irritable, anxious, overwhelmed. The next slide we'll talk about is hypoarousal, so that opposite end. When someone's feeling too little, things that might be helpful could be going for a walk, listening to music that might be uplifting. We always encourage, like if someone's feeling really sad and really depressed, it might not be helpful to continue listening to sad music. Of course, there's a time and place for that, but maybe it's important to kind of change that emotional response. So it could look like smelling essential oils, kind of getting them out of where they are in that moment. Ice also comes into play here, so maybe holding ice and squeezing until it melts. Grounding again, of course, comes back in here. Maybe it's calling a friend, focusing on a meaningful connection, conversation. All of these pieces can be so helpful. Yes, I'm seeing some great examples in the chat as well. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip over this one just for now, but when we think about trauma, there's so many different kinds of symptoms that come into play. And a lot of times we're working with people who also experience dissociation. Are you familiar with dissociation or someone who might be experiencing dissociation? What does that look like? Yes, diagnosed with it. Emily, I'm going to replace the share for now. So dissociation looks different for everyone and could really fall on this continuum. I see some examples in the chat, different for different people. Yeah. So think about, I always give this example. If you've ever been driving, you're going from point A to point B and you have no idea how you got there, really referring that as kind of this highway hypnosis, or think about daydreaming and how that looks. Yes, they might appear disconnected, deep lost in thought, not really present. Yes. And so there's this continuum that Janina Fisher talks about, and it varies from person to person. So someone could, zone out for just a moment. But also dissociation at some point helps people to be in the zone. Think about peak performance for athletes, musicians, actors. And then sometimes at the moment of the trauma, people then experience these emergency responses. So their body is trying to tell them, stay calm, cool, and collected. As you continue maybe down this continuum, you'll notice all the way at the end, we're seeing borderline personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder. So as we get further down the continuum, we have this, again, from acute stress response to complex PTSD. This varies from person to person in complexity and severities. Oftentimes people compartmentalize some of this, but just notice that someone may not necessarily fall to the right end of this continuum, but may experience some dissociation at some point in their life. If this person is experiencing triggers, that can happen at any point as well. And so we know that trauma leaves these really both short-term and long-term effects. We talked about some of these symptoms. So anxiety, fear could result in physical health issues, relationship difficulties. It could become into a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so when we're talking about triggers, we briefly spoke about them before, but what are some examples when you think about triggers? What types of triggers come to mind for people that you're working with? Maybe someone's expressed to you, I'm feeling triggered. Are they familiar with what that trigger was? Feel free to share in the chat. Feeling powerless. Sounds are a big one, yeah. Places, loud noises, flashing lights, smells, time of year. Paperwork and assessments. So oftentimes we're working with people who have probably completed several assessments, intakes. I worked with someone, and I, at the time when I was working in supported housing, was their 26th case manager. So can imagine how exhausting it must be to repeat and retell their narrative and their story. Stress, feeling unheard. I saw Jackson and CJ both in the same mindset there, feeling not heard. Yeah. And so this can look different for each person. It could be time-related triggers. So thinking about anniversaries of deaths or losses, holidays, place-related triggers. So many of us mentioned specific environments that are triggering. Ooh, a facial expression, yes. Maybe a raise of the eyebrow is triggering for someone. Relational triggers, so it could be this kind of perceived feeling of abandonment, rejection, humiliation. Internal triggers, so maybe this person's experiencing an emotion or sensation and it's triggering for them. Someone's tone of voice, smells, yeah, sensory triggers, body telling us something that's going on. So to help people cope with triggers, interaction with criminal justice system, yeah. Sometimes we can help people eliminate or avoid, but oftentimes we can't avoid a trigger forever. We know that, we can't prevent a person from experiencing a trigger 24/7. There is a chance that they may experience a trigger, or they may notice or hear or feel a sound, smell, taste that reminds them of a traumatic event. So oftentimes we're helping individuals anticipate those triggers. Sometimes if you help them kind of prepare and identify what are those warning signs, what are those triggers, knowing that triggers can't be avoided, it can be helpful to think about what you might do if you are aware of those triggers. Sometimes it is through really noticing and acknowledging verbally, like distinguishing the past from the present. My body is safe. I might be feeling overwhelmed and I'm not in danger right now. So there's so many different ways to support someone. And especially when we think about trauma recovery, we think about first and foremost safety and stabilization. So this is the part of us where, or a lot of the work that we're doing, really teaching skills, establishing a safe environment, we're building a trusting relationship, we're ensuring that this person has emotional safety, and really encouraging this person to learn new skills to be able to successfully integrate into the community. In supportive housing, we know that there are individuals who experience trauma at higher rates. And we talked a little bit about complex trauma, which is this prolonged interpersonal trauma that happens over and over throughout childhood. Sometimes there is a lack of disclosure or under recognition of complex trauma. Maybe people are minimizing their experiences or thinking it's not that bad or I'm fine now. And we know that trauma impacts that stress response so that fight or fight or flight, freeze, shut down. And oftentimes this is what we're seeing people engage in avoidance or agitation. So this substance use, disordered eating, cluttering behaviors, maybe increase in self-harm, verbal or physical agitation or irritability. And that's so true, Marissa. Yeah. And I think that's one of the hardest things too, anywhere, especially if someone is in an environment that could be re-triggering or re-traumatizing, it can be hard to feel safe and it can be hard to heal and recover and feel grounded when there's this constant chaos around. So when we're looking at trauma-informed care, what we're really looking at is this paradigm shift. We're moving from what's wrong with you to this idea that instead of exploring like this traditional approach of people are bad and people need to be punished and people just don't care and people are trying to be difficult and people are making excuses, instead of putting blame on them, we're exploring what happened to you. And then the next shift is what's right with you, this kind of resiliency informed approach, the idea that people are resilient and people need our compassion to learn new skills to reduce some of their suffering. So trauma-informed care, this is through SAMHSA, has these 5 principles: safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, and empowerment. And I have a feeling many of these things you're already doing and utilizing within supportive housing. So when we're thinking about implementing trauma-informed care, a lot of what this is training staff on trauma, knowing when to recognize trauma, what it looks like, what it's not, its effects on people, how it shows up in supportive housing with the people that we serve. We're creating a safe environment. A lot of the initial interactions are building trust and building rapport. Encouraging peer support. So maybe there are places where you're encouraging connection to community, maybe group services, maybe additional recovery support resources in the community, and really empowering clients through our collaboration and through respecting and through validating, acknowledging that what they experienced was really difficult. How do you all typically, in your assessment, ask about trauma? What does that look like for you? Do you ask about trauma? Are you told not to ask about trauma? Allow it to present, not trauma directly, but their current emotional state. Ask if there were any traumatic experiences, not trauma, but their reactions to stress. And I think that's a really great way to notice some of these responses. Focus on their resiliency, asking about relationships. And it can be really helpful to kind of normalize some of these experiences. Love that response. In the chat, I see Amber says, you don't have to share too much of the details as I'm not a practicing mental health provider, but have you ever experienced something that was very painful to you or that was extremely difficult in your life? And you're right, it can be so hard to open up to someone you don't know. And we're never pushing or pressuring or demanding that someone tells us every detail. And we're also being mindful, if someone is disclosing or discussing trauma with us, we want to validate. We don't want to be overly curious and request details. We want to make sure that this person is safe and providing referrals as needed. But it can be so important to even acknowledge, like, thank you so much for trusting me and sharing this with me. Acknowledging how difficult it must have been to share that story. I appreciate you taking the time to disclose that to me and the courage that it took to share. Whatever feels right for you and authentic for you, it might come off different for each person. And yes, wellness recovery action planning or WRAP plans help some of this part, what we look like when we're doing well. Absolutely. So a lot of what we're doing is kind of the basics. We're offering support and validation. We're asking questions. We're ensuring safety. We're trying to avoid interrupting. We're actively listening and offering information if this person needs additional resources. The most important thing that you can do is really listen to someone and hold space for someone. I know that hold space now connects to Wicked, but I've been saying hold space for forever. So thinking about holding space for someone and being present with someone means more than you realize. Yeah, staying in tune to all emotional responses and facial expressions. Also connecting with supervisors. Sometimes we don't realize that we're making certain facial expressions. Building a relationship, yeah, meeting them where they're at. So this last part, and I'm realizing our time, but we'll provide this with you. These are things that we've covered in previous webinars as well, if you've been, but thinking about interventions that can be quite helpful. Yeah, and I love that creative piece for sure. When we're teaching grounding, we talked a little bit about some of these things, but helping a person to manage dissociation or manage really difficult emotions and helping them to stay present or literally like grounded to the earth in this present moment. It could look like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique. So 5 things you see, 4 things you can feel or touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. I sometimes replace taste with 1 thing that you're grateful for if this person has a difficult relationship with food. Deep breathing, etc. DBT techniques can be quite helpful. If you're not familiar with DBT, always encourage additional training to prevent doing harm for sure. Yes, DBT, balancing acceptance and change. So being able to use mindfulness or teach emotion regulation. Distress tolerance is a really big one in navigating a crisis. So helping people to use skills without making things worse. So without acting on self-destructive behaviors, being able to self-soothe, being able to really cope ahead. Super empowering. Yeah, I love DBT. I'm a DBT fangirl for sure. CBT can also be quite helpful thinking about restructuring thoughts and also being mindful, like the goal is not to invalidate a person's experience, but to help them think about this differently or more productively. Could look like psychoeducation, relaxation skills, whatever feels right for this person. Psychoeducation, we talked about, again, like I shared, some people really enjoy the idea that you're able to explain what trauma is and how it happens in your brain and what it does, and really normalizing those reactions while also providing referrals or additional support if needed. Always encouraging self-care. This is so much more than we realize, and I think this term kind of became diluted post-pandemic, but what we're really doing is suggesting activities that almost channel this person's inner child and really accessing joy again. So it could look like meaningful movement, intentional movement, creative outlets, engaging with social support networks, and also for ourselves. We need to, as you know, put on our own oxygen mask before helping others. So being mindful that if we're hearing a lot of really difficult and challenging stories, that we're also taking time for ourselves and also validating that sometimes these things are out of our control. So really being able to connect to things that are joyful and meaningful. What we've also seen that's quite helpful in some of my favorite things, cats, bunnies, coloring, and mountains, as you can see here, are comfort rooms or comfort kits. And this has happened in some locations. Excuse me, I don't know if any of your agencies have a place like this in your agency, or a room or a space where you as staff can go to, or if you're in supportive housing, maybe there's a office space that allows for this. But when someone wants time alone, personal space, noise, or a space free of noise or free of distractions, people have developed these kind of comfort rooms to include a variety of things that allows this person to re-engage with some of these things that are joyful and peaceful. Again, quiet, not intended to like be the lunchroom that's where people are chatting and talking and engaging, but really a space away. Maybe there's essential oils here. Maybe there's, I almost said CD players, I don't know, radios, music. Maybe there's artwork on the walls that's comforting. Maybe there's a fish tank or other things that people can kind of engage and interact with. Fidget toys, kind of self-soothing items could be helpful. So we'll share this resource with you because there's some additional guidelines on how to create these rooms if it's possible for your agency. But also on your desk. I mean, I have so many things on my desk that I find quite helpful, and then helping the people that you're serving create these kind of comfort or self-soothing kits. So I know that I went through all of that very, very, very quickly, and being mindful of our time and your time as well. So really wrapping up, and again, you will have all of these resources, but acknowledging trauma as an injury or an emotional injury or an emotional response to an event or a series of events that really impacts a person's ability to cope and navigate life and move through the world. We know that some people do develop post-traumatic stress disorder, and there are so many different strategies that we as supportive housing staff or people working in the community can use to help a person heal from or find relief from or be able to navigate those really difficult, intense emotional responses to really improve their quality of life. We do have some resources. Some of these might be, I'm realizing, could be New Jersey based, but some additional support, Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain, some apps that could be helpful, assessments to add if that's possible or helpful. I'm sure Washington has so many additional resources, some books that I absolutely love. This was the chart that I was referring to, this top left one. Much of the PowerPoint was created from this flip chart, and Janina Fisher's work. The Body Keeps Score, Polyvagal Theory, My Grandmother. All these books are incredible. Highly recommend adding them to your permanent bookshelf if that's feasible for you. We're also going to share an evaluation, so I hope that you can take a moment to complete this. Thank you so much for being with us and for your time. I'll go back to those books. And these are just a few that I personally really love. I'm sure there's others that I did not include here. I mean, there are others that I didn't include, but some of the go-to ones that I think are helpful if you're someone who wants to learn more or do this work. So grateful for you all for being here. Thank you for your patience and dedication and commitment to this work. We know it's not easy, and we are so appreciative of you and your time. Emily shared the evaluation in the chat. If you have any additional questions, my email is here, but thank you so much for sticking it through, for hanging in there, for your engagement. I'm so grateful for you all and wishing you a wonderful, cozy rest of your Wednesday. Take care, everyone. This webinar is called Identifying and Addressing. I'll go back to the first. Trauma, Essential Strategies for Supportive Housing Staff. See you next month. Take care. Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.